These are the Inuits, one of the few tribes that, despite having contact with Western culture, have managed to keep their traditions alive. The first thing you need to know about them is that the word Eskimo is extremely offensive. This is why we call them Inuits. Even though Greenland is part of Denmark, they have their own laws, their own language, and their own government. And in the past few years, lots of Chinese, Australian, and American investors have flocked here. Why? Well, I guess you might be able to figure that one out. Natural resources-wise, Greenland is the new Africa. There's oil, gas, zinc, gold, there's plenty of it, and it's mainly unexploited. This explains why Donald Trump is suddenly so interested in this territory. At the end of this video, you'll understand why that interest is not quite as crazy as it might seem. Imagine a village with little more than 50,000 inhabitants, but the oil reserves of Russia. This is Greenland's current situation, and this is why news like this is to be taken seriously.
No joke, Trump really does want to buy Greenland.
Yes, I know. When it comes to Donald Trump, it's hard to tell whether he's kidding or not. And of course, tweets like this don't make it any easier.
Trump, I promise I will not do this to Greenland.
But this time, it makes a lot of sense. We all know that Trump is trying hard to make history, and this is perhaps one of his less crazy attempts to achieve that goal. For one, it's not the first time that America has tried to buy Greenland. Back in the 1950s, President Harry S. Truman made a solid purchasing offer to the Danish Crown. And let's not forget that America has already bought many other lands from other countries. Louisiana, Florida, and Alaska were bought from France, Spain, and Russia, respectively. And finally, when it comes to natural resources, Greenland is the promised land. The island is widely believed to host several natural resources, including lead, zinc, iron ore, gold, copper, and last but certainly not least, dear old oil. And if all the studies are right, Greenland contains 15% of the world's undiscovered oil beds. But if you still aren't fully convinced that Trump's not crazy for trying to buy Greenland, here's the real deal. Greenland's political status is far from clear. Yes, right now it's an autonomous region within the Kingdom of Denmark, but its political autonomy is growing, and in the future it might become an independent country. Now the question becomes, well, how do you even buy countries or territories? Is Greenland really that good of an investment? And would Greenlandic citizens have a say in what happens? Well, today we're going to answer all of these questions and more, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
Empires for sale.
Usually, countries expand by violent conquering or peaceful annexation, but these aren't the only formulas. Our story begins in 1803, when Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, purchased about 828,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon's France. This is what we know of today as the states of Louisiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. For $15 million, the US doubled the size of its young republic. Of course, it sparked a bit of controversy back then, but France badly needed the money. Napoleon, he wanted to conquer Europe, which was far from cheap, and America wanted to become a grown-up country. So the treaty was signed, and immediately after, one of the signers, founding father Robert Livingston, made this famous statement.
We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives. From this day, the United States takes their place among the powers of the first rank.
But this is not the end of the story. You see, the 19th century offered lots of opportunities for a young republic to expand. The Spanish Empire was at the brink of bankruptcy, and it was trying to keep its colonies in South America. And France was putting all of its conquering energies into Africa. So basically, they couldn't care less about North American territories, and again, they needed money. And this is when America was more than willing to do business. America's second big purchase was Florida in 1819. Even though Spain had long rejected the US's offers to purchase the territory, the Kingdom of Spain was having some serious trouble in the colonies. Several revolutions in Central and South America demanded their attention, and the kingdom was worn out by the war against Napoleon in Europe. So the king had to make a tough decision, and that's how Florida was ceded to the US, which is largely seen as a great diplomatic victory. From that moment on, the US was more than happy to acquire new territories from Mexico, Spain, Germany, etc. But the biggest purchase came decades later, and that, of course, was Alaska. Yes, America's biggest state was bought from Russia for $7.2 million in 1867. Tsar Alexander II decided to sell it because the territory would be very difficult to defend should any future conflict arise. The deal made some politicians frown, but it soon became clear that it had been a great move. Between the purchase in 1867 and the final Alaskan gold rush in the Klondike, many people flocked to the region looking to fulfill their own American dream. Alaska only managed to become a state in 1959, and according to reports, extractive industries accounted for 15% of its GDP in 2016. And what do these industries extract exactly? Well, yes, of course, that would be oil. As of now, Alaska is one of the top 5 crude oil producers in the nation, and the state's output in 2017 was the highest in 3 years. The state also ranks 3rd in the US for natural gas production. So again, weird as it might sound, buying Alaska from the Russians was actually a pretty solid investment. But okay, I know what you're thinking. All that land was purchased from absolute monarchies or colonial powers. The people living there, they didn't have much say about who they wanted to be governed by. But now things have changed. Greenlanders have rights and they vote in elections. And besides, is Greenland really such a great business opportunity? Well, let's have a look, shall we?
The would-be richest country on Earth.
Despite the enormous wealth of resources Greenlanders have under their feet, their most important industry at the moment is fishing, which contributes 90% of the island's total export value. In fact, more than a third of these 56,000 people living in Greenland work one way or another for the Danish government. Some of them are civil servants, and others are employed at some subsidizing company, like a shopping mall. Yep, you heard that right. Greenland's capital, Nuuk, has little more than 16,000 inhabitants, and they have a mall that is paid for with Danish money. Every year, Denmark spends around $530 million in transfers to Greenland. That's more than $9,000 per inhabitant every year. And Denmark citizens, they get little in return. But things are changing. A few years ago, a lot of Chinese and Australian mining companies started showing interest in Greenland's potential. And that's when Europe realized they couldn't let the Chinese be the only ones.
We need innovative partnerships with other countries over raw materials. Companies are pushing the Commission for this. They need this to survive. Europe is not so wealthy in raw materials and needs to do better at forming partnerships with other countries. Antonio Tajani, European Commissioner of Industry, in 2012.
And the question is, why? I mean, having so much oil and other resources, why don't they exploit that wealth? Is it because of environmental concerns? Please. But let's be serious here. Of course, everybody would love to exploit those natural resources, but good luck drilling under a kilometer-thick layer of ice. Yes, just in case you didn't realize, Greenland has a ton of ice, and in some places we're talking about layers that can surpass 1 kilometer in thickness. And even though climate change might make things easier, it also creates other problems. That oil we're talking about is concentrated on the coast, and if you thought the Greenlandic coastline was like the frozen version of Venice Beach, well, you better think again. You know that iceberg that sunk the Titanic? Well, chances are that it came from Greenland. Most of the icebergs in the Atlantic, they come from there, and we're talking about an ice rock that is as big as a residential building when it breaks off from the mainland in just a matter of minutes. Believe me, you don't want to have an oil platform right next to a place where icebergs are forming. And guess what? The more the ice cap melts, the more icebergs there are. But assuming that you manage to find a way to extract some oil from a safe spot or drill through a 1 kilometer thick layer of ice, then you'll have the next problem, and that's infrastructure. For example, in the northernmost part of the island, an Australian company is preparing to exploit a zinc mine. Once they finish building the project, it might even become the world's biggest zinc mine. But don't forget that the distance from that mine to the Greenlandic capital, Nuuk, is as far as the distance from central Norway to Gibraltar, which is near Spain. And there are no roads, no railways to connect those 2 points. Remember that the central part of Greenland is completely unfit for human habitation. In fact, only 3% of the island's entire surface is fit for living. This explains why there are over 56,000 Greenlanders who are concentrated in just a few villages. Of course, though, there can still be mines that are profitable. A good example is the zinc mine that we're talking about. But in order to make it happen, this Australian company, whose name is Ironbark, had to invest more than $500 million. In other words, in order to extract wealth in Greenland, you have to make a big investment. But let's stop talking about economics and let's dig deeper into politics. Because even if Greenland could build that infrastructure and technology became cheaper, America would still need to convince the Danish and the Greenlanders to sell out to them. And, well, what are the chances of that happening? Well, let's find out.
A strange relationship.
Greenland has been part of the Kingdom of Denmark since 1814. Still, they have kept most of their Inuit tradition and laws. And you might wonder, well, how is this possible? How can Denmark, one of the most modern countries on Earth, accept a region where they don't even have laws to grant private land? And that's not all. We're talking about the area of the planet with the world's highest suicide rate, where gender violence and alcoholism are still pretty common, and crime rates outnumber those of any European country. The truth is that, despite being owned by the Kingdom of Denmark since 1814, Greenland became an autonomous region in 1974, basically an autonomous county. It became even more independent in 2009 when more than 70% of Greenlanders voted in favour of the Self-Government Act. Now Danish isn't even the official language of the island. The government is pushing hard to have the Kalaallisut language taught in all schools. Greenland even has a local parliament. So most of their relationship with Copenhagen can be summarised by the 2 reserved seats that they have in the Danish parliament. This, and of course the money, because for 200 years Denmark has been transferring money to Greenland and getting little in return. And especially after the 1950s, Denmark sought to transform Greenland and its economy into a completely self-sufficient one. For example, in the 1950s and 1960s, Danish-funded and Danish-designed housing and other infrastructure contributed to turning Nuuk, Greenland's capital, into a city. If you go to Nuuk, you can find lots of European amenities and malls, all paid for by Denmark. But still, life expectancy is 10 years shorter than Denmark's, unemployment is high, and the region has, as we mentioned, the world's highest suicide rate. And in the cultural clash between Inuit tribalism and Danish influence, you can understand why so many Greenlanders want to become a sovereign nation. Their independentist party is a powerful force in parliament, and more than 67% of the adult population is convinced that independence is the way to go.
I still believe that Greenland will achieve independence during the time that I'm still active in politics. Aleqa Hammond, former Greenlandic premier.
But as you can imagine, Denmark wants to keep Greenland because after decades of paying so much without getting anything in return, things may finally change.
Greenland, the country set to cash in on climate change. Record temperatures threaten traditional ways of life in Greenland, but as the sea ice retreats, new mining, fishing, and tourism opportunities are helping communities to adapt.
As global warming continues to melt the Arctic ice, Greenland's resources are becoming more accessible. The political establishment in Greenland has made extracting those resources their focal point in order to achieve full independence from Denmark. And again, if you thought that those Greenlandic nationalist politicians so proud of their Inuit traditions are die-hard ecologists who will never sell out to the big oil companies, well, you'd better think again.
Greenlanders are very good at seeing new opportunities. We have simply refused to be victimized due to climate change. I am very optimistic. I see more positive options for the country than negatives. I wish that it weren't happening, but it is, and that's a fact. Once it's there, you have an obligation to do the best of it. Aleqa Hammond, the country's former prime minister.
In fact, in 2013, Greenland's parliament reversed a decades-old ban on uranium mining. So another Australian mining company, Greenland Minerals, already has plans for a major uranium and rare earth minerals mine at a mountain in the southern coast. But it's not just about the reserves, it's also about the Arctic routes that might develop in the future. The receding ice cap is opening up the Northwest Passage, a change that has the potential to completely reshape global shipping. If this comes to pass, we would be talking about routes that would be a gift for nations like China. The passage became ice-free in 2007, and countries soon began talking about it as a potential seasonal alternative to the Suez and Panama canals, since it would enable the shippers to save time and avoid pirate-infested regions. All of this explains why Trump is so interested in Greenland, but the Danish government is absolutely not willing to make this purchase happen.
Greenland is not for sale. Greenland is not Danish. Greenland belongs to Greenland. I strongly hope that this is not meant seriously. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen responded.
And this is the question that we have for you. Do you think Greenlanders would be happy to be sold to America? Should they keep trying for independence? Do you think they can really reap the benefits of the enormous wealth that they have under their feet? Well, please leave your answer in the comments section below. And of course, don't forget to visit our friends from ReconsiderMedia.com, the podcast that provided the voices in this video that were not mine. Also, if you like this video, remember that we publish brand new ones every week, so hit that subscribe button to avoid missing any posts. And as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.